Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the third webinar on automated driving on this very warm afternoon, in which the research on spatial and transportation impacts and meaningful human control is being presented. We have a nice program, but first I will introduce myself. I will be chairing this third webinar. My name is Natascha Agricola, and I work as a senior business developer at TNO. I am more focused on the smart, safe and sustainable mobility and the cooperation with cities and regions. We have 3 presentations this afternoon on the societal and human perspective of AV. What will our lives look like? What will happen if the public space, such as parking lots, get influenced by AV? And what does it mean if we delegate the responsibility of driving to a computer? With respect to the topics of today, and the impact of AV and our activity patterns and the use of our cities, I cannot ignore the large impact of COVID-19. Mainly due to all the governmental rules, we have changed a lot in our behavior. And with respect to the use of the public space, these questions get more tangible. Social needs, economical activities, mobility, they all have a spatial claim. So what do we want our cities to look like? How do we want to behave and take responsibility? From this perspective, today can be an interesting point of view for the future and how we would like to benefit from AV in a responsible and human way. Some instructions about this webinar. You are asked to switch off your microphone and your video, but we encourage you to use our public chat to ask questions or remarks. The presentations will be shared online, and that's also for the reason that we started recording. Then something about the agenda. After this introduction, we have 3 presentations, and I will come to that later. After each presentation, there's room for 1 or 2 questions. We have a discussion afterwards in which more room for discussion, and maybe also the link between the 3 presentations can be laid in the questions or the discussions. Okay, I go back to today. I start with today and I let our researchers take us into the future of AV. As I mentioned in my introduction, we all experience a lot of change due to Corona, including our travel behavior. And we see different opinions on what could happen in the near future, say 21, 22. And the point is we do not know yet. Thanks to all the data and science, we will be able to model the different scenarios and prepare ourselves. And in these scenarios, however, we do not anticipate on the higher levels of automation. So my first question, and you can use the poll for that in short, is given this situation without the higher levels of automation, so like today, how will our travel behavior change due to Corona on the longer term, say 2022, when compared to the situation before Corona? And I will start a poll so you can make a choose. So one of the answers can be, it do not change at all. We will switch back to the same modes in use we did before. Or we use less public transport in favor of car or bike. Or we travel less on all modes, for instance, because we work more at home. D, we do not see a change in COVID, but we will continue to travel differently, more shared mobility and public transport. And maybe you have another option, option E, and then I encourage you to explain yourself in the chat, because I'm really curious what you think will happen. And I see answers coming in already. I will wait short, so everyone has an option to fill in. Okay. So what we see, and I hope you see it as well on the slides, is that most of us think option B will be valid. So we will use less public transport and use more cars or bikes, but maybe we'll also travel less. And let's see if I can go to the chat. Okay, I see Geert answering more public transport based on little shuttles. So that's a mix, really. Yeah, that's a nice answer. Okay. I see Jeroen is also typing in. Okay, maybe we come back to that later. Oh, okay. Jeroen is saying, I don't expect a lasting impact other than the effects of people trying out different travel options now. Yeah, that would be very nice. That is very nice. Okay. Having this picture in mind, we go to the future. And that's my next question. So assume we go to the year 2035 and assume that AV is possible for both private and for shared vehicles, and there's a penetration rate of amongst 50%. Do you think our travel behavior will change when compared with the situation earlier this year, just before Corona? And again, they are almost the same options. Some are slightly different. So I will start a poll again, and you can give your choice. And again, if you choose for other, it would be nice to have an explanation in the chat. So A, it doesn't change at all. The same modes in use, or less product in favor of AV or bike. Or C, we travel less on all modes. Or D, we travel more, including the use of shared mobility and public transport, like MAS. Or E, other. The answerings are coming in. I'll wait just any longer to give you the opportunity. Okay. And I will start publishing the results. So there's a large difference in the answers before. We see we will travel more. So I think that's the most extensive difference. We see that we travel more and use this shared mobility. So a bit also what the people who just entered the option E already explained. We try different things. What my point is that the situation is really explaining what we think, but it is also hard to see the future. And that brings me to our next presenters, because there are many assumptions that you can make how AV will be implemented, what it will mean, and also how attractive other transport options are. So I will give a short introduction to our presenters. First, all three of them, and then the first will take the floor, and that's Baiba Pudāne. She will explain her research on a day in the life with AV and go into the questions, will AV change what we do during traveling? And will it change our daily activities? And is value of time even a good measure to capture all these changes? The second presentation is from Francis Ostermeijer, and he will talk about the parking implications of AVs and go into this really integrating question: to what extent will changes in parking costs affect the residential and visitors' car use in cities? And the third is from Giulio Mecacci, and he will go into the automation, responsibility, and meaningful human control. So the focus of this talk is on the human responsibility. Is it possible to join human control and very high levels of automation? And what is a control about? And what does it mean to control something? And could a form of control be achieved to keep us responsible and safe? So this goes really into the ethics of what AVs can mean for us. I would like to ask Baiba to take the floor from now on, and I will give a shorter introduction about what Baiba is doing while we are switching the presentations. Okay, so Baiba, maybe you can put your camera on already and try to upload your presentation. We start with the presentation of Baiba Pudāne on the impact of AV. And Baiba is a PhD candidate at TU Delft at the Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management. She's conducting her research within the Transport and Logistics Group. Baiba has a background in mathematics and statistics, a bachelor, and in transport and logistics, a master. And a more personal fact about Baiba is that she's very personally interested in AVs because she's not quite confident on her driving skills due to a lack of practice, because she's living in the city and cycling a lot. So hopefully AVs will come in and make life more easy. Give the floor to you, Baiba.
Thank you very much, Natascha. And thank you everybody for being here and listening to my talk. Indeed, my talk is called A Day in the Life with Automated Vehicles. And that's a very nice summary. Actually, the credits go to Bart van Arem, who made this title in the first webinar. And today I would like to focus on part of my research, the most recent part, of course, together with my supervisors, Sander van Kranenburg and Casper Korus, which shows some empirical results indeed about how our days in the life with AVs may look like. So why would we expect any change? Of course, we can think of a very futuristic and vision of how AVs themselves might look very different. Maybe they offer much more comfort, space perhaps, and of course many opportunities to do something during travel. So here I would like to also start with a poll and asking, given such excellent futuristic automated vehicles, what would you imagine would be your first activity that you would like to perform during travel? And let me start a poll. Yeah. Okay. Would it be working, or would it be eating your meals while being in a rush, or engaging in some leisure activities or hobbies, or some other activity? And you feel free to comment on that in the chat. Or you would say, I wouldn't do anything particular at all. Okay. Waiting for a few more seconds. Okay, and we can see, clearly most of you, or a large share of you, would envision working during travel, and that perhaps is a little biased towards the audience of this webinar, who can do a lot of work with computers and online, as well as engage in leisure, as well as perhaps other activity. And I will briefly see if I have any comments in the chat. Okay, all of them, yes. Skyping and rest and sleep like in the train. Indeed, yeah. All of them depending on the occasion. Indeed, so I would have allowed you to indicate more options, but there is some limitation by the software. But indeed, there could be many possibilities. Moving on, so this presentation and my PhD is about not only travel in the life with automated vehicles, but actually days, the whole 24 hours in a life with automated vehicles. And so the question is, how would these activities and how would travel in automated vehicles, how could they change our days? And I have foreseen at least 4 possibilities how that could happen. Of course, first one, obviously, there may be no change at all. Some of you said, only a few of you said, I would not do anything during travel. Nothing changes. Also in other activities. It could be that activities are added to the daily schedule during travel only, but otherwise there is no much change. Or it could be also that there are no new activities during travel, perhaps the ones which you currently do in public transport, but no great change there. But yet you feel like adjusting your daily schedule because perhaps you feel less tired, you have more energy, and you want to do perhaps something more active at night, or there could be many other possibilities. And lastly, combining the two, of course, it is possible that there could be change both in onboard as well as in stationary activities. And here I have graphically depicted a scenario where, say, one activity from which might have been performed at some stationary location is somehow transferred to the travel episode, and thereby it could save time for a new activity, and that could very well also influence the travel patterns. So, so having these four options, yeah, I would again like to ask you, which of the four do you think would be more representative of your day? So, right. Or if you would like to mention another option, feel free to type inside the chat. All right, almost everybody has answered, so I'm going to publish the results. And an interesting result is indeed that I see many of you think that it would be both stationary and onboard activities that might change, and indeed there might be more advanced rearrangements because of the automated vehicles and all the possibilities. And the second is the option of only onboard activities, which is perhaps have less impact on the schedules. And finally, changing nothing at all is of course a possibility. Thank you for your answers. So, and this leads me to the research which I would like to show you, part of my PhD, where we indeed try to look at such changes, of course, in more detail. And what we did is we designed an interactive online tool whereby people could indicate how their day would look like, and they were asked to do that 2 times. First, using a current mode, for example, public transport, and second by using an automated vehicle. And the automated vehicle was introduced as allowing the activities to a very high extent, but one of the options randomly assigned was mentioning that there would be some interruptions because of the movements of the vehicle, as well as of potential motion sickness, but whereas the other said these would not be problems. Yes, the multitasking possibility was introduced to the respondents, and it is possible to select each activity either as a single activity or to be performed during travel, as shown. And so, what did we see? If I summarize the results based on these same 4 options, the results are as follows. So, somewhat surprisingly, a large share of people, more than half, said that they would not change anything at all. They would keep their current schedule. And then following that, and that matches also the answers of you earlier, there was a sizable change of people who said that both stationary and onboard activities would be changed, or rather they did not say it, but they indicated that in the schedules. As well as there were a group of people who changed only their stationary or only their onboard activities. And to further summarize, however, you can see that there were more changes, more people changed stationary activities than the number of people who changed onboard activities. However, the changes in onboard activities were very substantial. So you can see that these are the 3 most frequently selected activities during travel. And they also were very well reflected in your answers, I think. So work, meal, and leisure. And there's information about how the current mode users engage in these activities during travel, and how all the people percentage-wise imagine selecting them in automated vehicle, and there is a clear increase in all. And secondly, however, of those people who changed something in their stationary activity schedules, the changes were not very large. You could see that the box plots center more or less around 0, with slightly more leisure time than at present, and slightly more sleep time. But overall, the changes were much more modest. And so further, we analyze these results more formally by estimating a model which allows to estimate the changes on activity selection as well as on activity duration, and to estimate the impacts of AVs on these selection and duration aspects of activities. And we can see here confirmed that indeed that AV usage led to strong impacts on selection and duration of various onboard activities. And even more than that, there were some groups of people who had even higher selection and duration than others of activities during travel in automated vehicles, such as higher income and higher education, higher educated population were more likely to work or have meals in automated vehicles. As well as certain age groups wanted to use more time for leisure purposes in automated vehicles. And similarly, analyzing the effect of automated vehicle usage on stationary activity schedules, and that also reflects the descriptive statistics that I showed you before, there were indeed no changes in the average activity schedule. And here I must emphasize again the average schedule. There might have been changes in individual schedules. People indicated all the different kinds of adjustments, but the average stayed fairly the same. And also the mean number of trips. Some of you might be wondering, how about the travel time? Did people travel more? The mean number of trips did not change substantially. However, the total travel time is not very well measurable with the survey, because the trip times to specific activities were fixed. So we can only say whether the number of trips increased or decreased, and indeed they didn't change. However, we saw some changes in specific socio-demographic groups, such as adults with children, with young children, could find more time for leisure in their days and spend perhaps less time getting ready, and so forth. And finally, we analyze the relationship between certain stationary activity schedules and onboard activity schedules. And this comes back to the interaction of whether onboard activities would influence the schedules stationary or vice versa. So both could be the case. However, using this survey and using this analysis, we cannot say the direction of influence or which changes indeed, but we can see how are certain activity durations stationary and onboard related. And here again, we can see several significant effects. For example, if somebody indicated a longer getting ready activity in automated vehicle, and getting ready being such as personal care or getting ready in the morning or evening, then that was associated with less meals selected. So perhaps the breakfast was substituted with getting ready activity or was seen as synonyms, as well as the getting ready activity at stationary locations was shorter. So there are several intuitive aspects that we could see that there is a relationship between the onboard and stationary schedules. So, and that brings me to the final content slide of this presentation, and that is, so what does that mean? Our days in the future with automated vehicles. Will the activity schedules with automated vehicles be different than we have now? So I have mentioned before, on aggregate, the average schedule did not seem to change much. And that brings further to the question, so should we then consider that activity schedules might change, or should we say, well, we can safely assume that there are no changes? And yet I would like to say, and that I have been argued in my PhD throughout, that we cannot assume that there will be no changes. And actually, the question of whether value of travel time is a good measure is a very similar question to whether activity schedules will stay the same or not. Because the value of travel time essentially assumes that we might travel somewhat further, somewhat select further destinations because travel provides less resistance, but there is not a specific interaction between certain onboard and stationary activities. So even if the average schedule stays the same, I would say that for each individual, it is not the average schedule that matters, but it matters the personal individual change. And that is likely to bring benefits if they can re-optimize, for example, their days to the population as well. And furthermore, of course, there's a limitation of this study that where people are we really able to imagine very well our days in the future? Could we have imagined how our days would look with the COVID-19? Or could we imagine how our days would look with mobile phones some 15 years ago? And perhaps there was a large share of people who said there would be no changes expected, but yet, for the sake of a third of the respondents or more, I think our tools should be ready to capture these kind of potential changes. And these changes are, so the value of travel time as a very convenient and very easy and very easily understandable measure, yet is not able to capture these changes. And further, I thought of bringing up two more questions for discussion, which I'm happy to engage even more, which are somewhat more distantly related to my research. But yet, will automated vehicles lead to more person and vehicle travel? And I have seen the value of travel time discussion always being coupled with a lower value of travel time, more person travel, people willing to travel more. But as far as I have seen from my studies, this one, as well as a previous study with qualitative interviews, very few people expect more travel on daily basis, yet they indicate more travel for holidays. But yet, would that mean that there would be less vehicles on the road? That's a different question. So I would encourage, whenever you think or discuss this question, to always separate between the person and the vehicle travel. And here a related question is, what would shared automated vehicles do for the total number of vehicles on the road? And a popular way of arguing is that sharing vehicles, of course, two people making the same trip and being in the same car would reduce the number of vehicles by one. But at the same time, having shared vehicles available in the location would likely reduce the costs, the monetary costs of using this service. So perhaps it becomes more accessible to a wider group of people, and perhaps this group of people is comparable to the current public transport users. And then you can see that model shift from public transport to shared automated vehicles can actually act against the benefits of shared automated vehicles. I have discussed this in one of reflection type of papers, my PhD. And I think that's a very relevant discussion between the personal and the vehicle miles traveled in the future. And finally, will automated vehicles lead to more congestion? So there might be more vehicles on the road, perhaps. Does that automatically mean more congestion? There is one aspect which is often overlooked somewhat, is that congestion is created not only by number of vehicles, but also by the choices of travel times, the departure times of all these vehicle users. And here we again need to look at how automated vehicles influence that choice. And that is also another ongoing work or close to be finished work in my PhD, which shows that certain activities might performed during travel might influence the departure time choices. And that's also something that we see in this data, although I didn't show more statistics about it. And say if performing work activity during travel allows the person to depart later perhaps, or performing home-like activity during travel allows the person to depart earlier, then we can see that there is more varied impacts on congestion, which depend not only on the number of vehicles, but also on the timing choices for the travel. So these are three reflection points. Feel free to react to those later, and with that, I would like to thank you for your presentation, and I would like to say, please stay in touch. I will still be in the TU Delft in the foreseeable future and continue investigating the impacts of technology on travel behavior as well as on transport system performance. And if you have any ideas for cooperation, let me know. So, with that, thank you.
Baiba. Thank you very much. And maybe could you answer one question that came in from Imke? Is there a fundamental difference between the activities in public transport and activities in automated vehicles?
Sure.
Did you into that as well?
Sure, that is a question which I get often, and I like it a lot, and I didn't mention it in this presentation, but I think there is a lot of difference, at least a lot of potential difference. So we know public transport now, we don't know much about automated vehicles in the future, but we can at least say public transport is public. It's public transport, so hence you do not have the privacy. You also are frequently interrupted, perhaps by announcements, by changes of modes you have to make, by the noise, and on all these aspects. And we can imagine that this fundamental difference between public transport and automated vehicles will also reflect in the activities that people can and want to do during travel. So indeed, well, it's a speculation indeed, but I would say that the changes are very likely.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, then I suggest we switch to Francis, and while he uploads his presentation, I will give a brief introduction. We continue with the presentation, the parking implications of AVs. And Francis is a PhD student at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam at the Department of Spatial Economics, and he expects to finish his research coming September. So the pressure is coming on. And Francis has a background in international economics and spatial transport and environmental economics. And a more personal fact about Francis is that he thinks the best part about life in the Netherlands is that you can get around by bike pretty well. And I think that sounds good for Amsterdam specifically, where you live.
That's right, Natascha. Yes.
Okay.
So great that you can cycle everywhere. I just I love that about it.
Okay. Success with your presentation.
Indeed. Thank you so much for the introduction and welcome. And I hope you're all healthy and safe at home. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about my PhD project, which in two of the papers we focus on the implications of parking with automated vehicles, essentially. And I'm very happy to be following up from Baiba's research, because what's interesting is what Baiba looks at is how preferences might change with automated vehicles. And it seems like preferences for different sorts of activities are not really changing too much for these survey respondents that she's looked at. But what I look at in my research is a little bit more at prices, and how, because of changes in prices due to AVs, we might see changes in travel decisions. So this is, of course, a joint work together with both of my supervisors at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, Professor Jos van Ommeren and Hans Koster. And yeah, so let me show you a little bit about what we're going to be doing today then. So firstly, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview in terms of how we approach this research topic. I'll then go into these two papers where we examine, firstly, the parking implications of AVs for residents, and then the implications for visitors. And then I'll conclude with some remarks and end with a short food for thought session. Okay, so firstly, our research strategy. So AVs don't exist just yet. So it's a little bit difficult to get actual estimates based on prices for how driverless cars are going to directly affect the spatial structure of cities. So what we decided to do in this research project is have a 3-step approach, or essentially a 2-step approach, where firstly we look into the literature about how AVs are likely to affect mobility. You know, and then you can think about, okay, they're going to affect the way that people can park. They might affect how easy it is to use a car. Maybe you can fit more people into a car. You have these driverless taxis or so. And then given these potential changes in mobility, then we want to look at, okay, how do these mobility aspects actually affect the spatial structure? So for example, how do parking costs affect where people decide to live and work in a city? And that's where the empirical research comes into it. So these are the 2 papers that I'm going to be presenting about today, which is really looking at trying to understand how parking costs affect residential and visitor parking demand, and thereby car use in a nutshell. So, but very briefly, and first of all, what is the spatial structure? So what do we view as the spatial structure? There are 3 main components of the spatial structure of a city. You have land uses, and here you can see a photo of the Kop van Zuid in the Rotterdam area, where you can really see, you know, like a big diversity of different land uses. So you have the gemeentebuilding, for example, where there's both employment and residential land uses. Then you see this very famous bridge, of course, and you know, so you can see transport infrastructure. There are also some trees somewhere around, so you can see all these different land uses. There is also, you know, you can also see density going on. So you can see that there is a high density. There are large buildings where lots of employment activities and residential activities are going on. And another key component then is how transport flows work within that city. So, you know, what is in the daytime, for example, when is it that people travel to work? How do they travel to work? What speeds on average do they use? And what does this mean exactly for safety? So today I'm going to be mainly talking about transport infrastructure in terms of parking, but in 2 of our other papers that are part of this PhD, we also look at accessibility, and we look at accidents. So we look at the effects, potential benefits, for, safety benefits, for example, from no longer facing accidents due to let's say level 5 driverless cars, not level 5 driverless cars, and therefore you won't experience mobile phone accidents anymore. But we also look at the potential effects of improvements in accessibility, because more people can access and use a car. What would this potentially mean for density in cities? Now, these are 2 other papers, but I would be happy to discuss them if you're interested in that. Okay, but to the topic of this talk today. So what is our vision of driverless cars in the future? Well, with level 5 driverless cars, it's possible to eliminate all this parking space in the city, essentially, because in the future, driverless cars may not require parking anymore at the final destination of the passenger. So you can think about a resident, for example, who owns a car and uses that car in order to go to work. During the day, they take their car to work, and then in the evening they come back and they park at home. But this involves costs, because there are costs of the land that the car is parked on, but there are also monetary costs to that individual who has to pay for a parking permit, but also may have to cruise and search for parking in their area, because in some areas in the city, for example, in Amsterdam, there's not much on-street parking, and therefore it's costly in order to find a space. So one potential implication of driverless cars is that we can eliminate these parking costs, essentially. So that's the topic of the first paper that we look at. We look at how do parking costs affect residential car use? And this paper is now published in Regional Science and Urban Economics. And basically, in a nutshell, what our research design is, first we want to try to look at, okay, because AVs are likely to reduce parking costs, what would then be the effect of this reduction in parking costs on increases in car ownership? So this gives a very brief overview of our findings. So what you can see in the left map, I hope it's somewhat visible, is a map of the 4 main metropolitan areas in the Netherlands. So you have, the metropolitan area of Amsterdam at the top, Rotterdam and The Hague at the bottom left, and then there's the Utrecht area on the right. And basically, you see a map of estimated residential parking costs over space. And what you can see is that in the city centers of these areas, this is where parking costs are generally the highest for residents. So what we might expect as well is that these are areas where the advent of driverless cars, which are expected to reduce parking costs, are likely to have the largest effects on vehicle demand, essentially. And in the right-hand plot, you can see a figure of car ownership in 2017. So essentially, this is what we're trying to look at. So what we try to look at in this research paper is how do residential parking costs impact car ownership? And what this allows, and essentially, we need to, this is a challenging thing because there are many other confounding factors that are going on. For example, you might think, okay, people living in the city, they don't need a car as much because they can get around in most places with their bike. Or people might locate in the city center because they have a preference for using public transport rather than using the car. So what we try to do in this research is we try to control for these other aspects which impact car ownership and residential parking prices in order to only isolate the effect of residential parking costs on car ownership. And essentially what we find in our research is that the disparity between parking costs between the city center and the periphery of a city explain around 30% of the difference in car ownership rates between the city center and the periphery. So the other 70% are explained by preferences and other factors, and around 30% are explained by parking costs. And what this means for AVs is that if these parking costs then go down, because residents no longer face these costs, we're likely to see particularly larger increases in car ownership and use in the city center as compared to the periphery. And what we find when we apply certain assumptions on what we expect to see with these parking costs based on a private AV scenario or a shared AV scenario, that we expect that car demand in city centers is likely to increase between 8 and 14% because of reductions in parking costs. So that's the key takeaway from our first paper. And now I would like to talk to you about a more recent study that we're doing, which is a collaboration together with the Gemeente Amsterdam in order to look at how do parking costs affect visitor demand. So while residential parking costs are relatively low, if you think about if you think about total, if you think about how much a resident pays for on-street parking in Amsterdam, it's a fraction of what a visitor pays for on-street parking. So what you might expect is that changes in due to AVs, because AV users will no longer need to pay for visitor parking, visitors might be much more likely to take their automated vehicle into the city center. So now looking a little bit more into the context of Amsterdam. Well, I mean, Amsterdam has very high on-street parking prices. You might be aware that in April of 2019, they raised the maximum parking price from €5 in the city center to €7.50. So they're pretty substantial costs per hour. And the goal of these parking prices is to discourage taking your car into the city. So what would happen then if that tool is no longer available to policymakers? If automated vehicles don't face these costs anymore, people might be just then taking a car all the time into the city because it's quite easy. But a secondary aspect of these high parking prices in the city is that it's also composing a large proportion of municipal revenues. So around 25% of Amsterdam's revenues and around 5% of their expenditures come from parking revenues. So losing that source of revenue might also have substantial consequences on the public budget. So what is it that we're looking at in this paper? So in this research topic, so we look at to what extent do parking prices affect visitor parking demand and traffic, in order to then be able to understand how how AVs might affect car use in the city in the future. So what you see in the left-hand map is parking prices before the change in policy in April of 2019. And then in the right part of the map, you see the parking prices after policy. And essentially, parking prices increased by between 10 and 100% throughout the city from one day to the next. So this gives us an interesting setting in order to examine, firstly, how does an increase in parking price affect the number of people taking their car into the city, in order to then be able to say, what would a decrease in parking price mean for people bringing their car to the city? But how do we do this analysis? So what we do is we collect data on all on-street parking transactions in Amsterdam between 2018 and 2019. And this is there's approximately 50 million transactions that occur in this time period. And we aggregate the number of arrivals and the duration at the parking meter level, and there are around 3,000 parking meters in Amsterdam. Then we also collect data on on-street parking substitutes. These are mainly off-street garages. There are private garages, public garages, and P&R facilities. And what we do is we perform a detailed event study where we control for location-specific effects, seasonality, weather, and other long-term trends. And you can this figure down here essentially gives an indication, more or less, of what we're picking up in this analysis. So what you can see on the y-axis is total occupancy in million hours of parking duration at a weekly level. And before the policy, there was around 1.2 million hours of parking occurring in Amsterdam on a weekly basis. And what you can see here is that if you compare 2018 to 2019, you see a sharp drop in the amount of parking use. And this is essentially, this is what we try to tease out in terms of what is the effect of the policy. So what are our findings? We find that the policy led to a reduction in arrivals of around 15%, so 15% fewer on-street visitor parking, and a reduction in the duration that people park of around 12%. We also estimate price elasticities, and we look at changes in off-street parking demand as well. And currently what we're looking at is what are the wider mobility effects of this policy? So what does it mean for traffic flows in the city? And currently we've collected data from these MoCo traffic cameras, which allow us to see what is the flow of traffic and the speed that traffic is going at, in order to understand how increases in parking prices affect traffic flows in the city. And essentially now, what we can then do with these estimates is that we can consider a reverse policy, where what would happen then, instead of prices going from 5 euros to 7.50 euros, the counterfactual situation to think about is what happens then when prices go from 7.50 euros to 1 euro throughout the city, or, like in the city center, but then in other places as well. What happens if parking prices become a lot smaller, essentially? And we do a very simple back of the envelope calculation. We're going to do some more advanced methods in our paper and in the further analysis. But basically, if we assume the prices become 1 euro throughout the city, and we know that approximately 50% of traffic are visitors and 50% are residents, then a rough estimate tells us that that the reduction in parking prices from their current levels to 1 euro would lead to an increase in traffic throughout the city of around 15%, and in particular in the city center of around 30%. So it suggests substantial increases in traffic throughout the city in the absence of policy intervention. So essentially what this paper brings to light is that if policymakers don't change policies about car use in the city, we're expecting to see much more car use in city centers, especially where prices are currently high. So to conclude, automated vehicles have benefits and costs. Some of the benefits are that current parking space can be repurposed and used for more valuable things. Like, for example, we can take away these on-street parking spots, we can use them for cycling paths, we can put trees there, we can do a lot with that valuable space, and that's fantastic. These are great benefits. But there are also costs, and we need to take that into account, policymakers, and we shouldn't be ignorant of that. So what our studies outline is that if we don't change our policies, particularly our parking policies, that's what I've been discussing today, we're likely to see a lot more car use in cities, particularly because that's where parking prices are high, and that's where parking prices cause constraints or really reduce the amount of people that use cars in cities, essentially. And this has, some important policy implications, namely that parking prices are no longer an effective tool to manage car use in the city. And this brings me to my final and concluding question to you all, because this is the next question that we need to answer as a society. What are we going to replace parking prices with? So, as a closing off, I want to ask the question to you: if parking prices are no longer an effective tool to manage car use in cities, what should municipalities do to avoid excessive use of automated vehicles? And the possible options are: A, nothing. Automated vehicles are smart and will solve the problem through artificial intelligence. B, municipalities might decide to charge a tax to enter the city, for example, London, what London does. C, charge vehicles a kilometer tax on particular roads. So, for example, roads in the city center will have a higher kilometer charge than roads outside of the city or in the outskirts of the city. And D, will municipalities restrict the use of AVs to certain areas? So these are my questions to you, and let me just open a poll. Give me one moment, start a poll, A, B, C, or D. So I hope you can see the poll. I'll give you a few minutes to respond to that. No, let's do 20 seconds actually. Yeah, I see 36 people have responded, and now we're at 42. That's a nice number. Wait another few seconds just in case anyone hasn't read it yet. Okay, I'm going to publish the results. So we see that most people think that C and D are appropriate actions or actions that the municipality would undertake, and that's interesting because, for example, C is it's quite related to what is currently done in cities, right? So charging a price for on-street parking which differs throughout the city, and that's a similar thing than a kilometer tax. And actually, most people think that we're going to restrict the use of AVs to certain areas. And that might also be related to safety concerns, right? Maybe we only want AVs to go on larger streets, through roads where they can, easily be taken off the area from where pedestrians are walking. So, thank you very much for your responses. I'm going to take that into consideration in my further work, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Francis, for this very good presentation, which gives a lot of insight. I see some questions already popping up in the chat, but maybe one to lift out. Colum asks, what will happen if people do not use the parking facility? For instance, AVs are circulating through the road network while doing stationary activities. What would you suggest?
So what is the implication of cars not using parking? Well, the implication is that parking costs are essentially zero then, right? So then you would be going to a situation from where they're currently €7.50 to essentially zero. So this is likely then to have even larger impacts on vehicle demand in cities.
So we need to look at one of the answers on your question then. That's your answer then. You have to take other measures. If as a society we want to make sure that car use does not that cities don't become overly congested, and that we have lots more cars driving around than we currently have, then we really need to rethink our vehicle policies in cities. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, then we go to our next presenter. And while Giulio can start up his presentation, I will again give a short introduction. So we continue with the presentation on automation, responsibility, and meaningful human control. And as we started with, AV can bring very many advantages, but this might come at the expense of other values if done wrong. And Giulio will focus on the human responsibility. Giulio is a postdoc at TU Delft at the Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management. He obtained his PhD degree at the Donders Institute of Brain, Cognition and Behavior in Philosophy and Neurotechnology in 2017. And he currently teaches ethics of technology at TU Delft and theoretical cognitive sciences at the Radboud University in Nijmegen. And he starts there as an assistant professor in September. A more personal fact about Giulio is that he likes the public transport where possible and does not even possess a car. So we are very neutral in this research. Okay, good luck, Giulio.
Thank you so much, Natascha. So here I am broadcasting from the top of the TPM building where the weather is like 40 degrees minimum. So if I pass out, you know where I am, you can come saving me. What am I gonna tell you today? I'm gonna talk about automation, responsibility, and meaningful human control. But first of all, oh no, yes, okay, I have to click. Who am I? Well, Natascha did a great job already, so I don't need to sort of introduce myself further. Let's get into the action. I'm a philosopher. I will start with an apology, so bear with me. I'm here to crash the party. What I'm going to claim today is that the path to enlightenment, this is what we're doing here, right, begins with control and responsibility. So as we have seen in the previous presentations, there's important work is being made to pave the way towards increasing levels of automation. This will bring very many advantages, right? More comfort, less pollution, a lot of driving time saved, possibly, and hopefully more safety in traffic. This, however, some say might come at the expense of other values, right? If we don't do it right. And in particular, the value that I want to focus on in this talk today is human responsibility, human moral responsibility. What I will claim is that, contrary to what some people think, it might be possible to join human control and very high levels of automation, and therefore safeguard, well, this value of human responsibility. So this, however, requires us to change a little bit of our perspective on what control is about, and also what it means to control something. So we need a more meaningful form of control that should be achieved to keep us, those controllers, drivers of any form of automated system, responsible and safe. So onto this, automated systems are well known to create some problems. Let's say that prevent us humans to achieve a sufficient degree of control, let's say, over them. But this reduced control can, under certain circumstances, lead to reduced responsibility, so that the controllers might end up being out of the loop, and we might face these situations in which we have serious problems meaningfully pointing towards those who are responsible for the behavior of an automated system. So these situations, traditionally, well, recent tradition, but they have been called responsibility gaps. There are several reasons why intelligent artificial systems challenge human control. One of those is, for instance, that intelligent machines might be able to learn new things, which would make their behavior potentially more unpredictable. And in this case, it will be very hard to be able to deem some person accountable should these systems commit any kind of reckless action or undesirable behavior. Also, intelligent machines are typically subject to several kinds of opacities. So certain techniques, like, for instance, machine learning, deep learning, that can lead sometimes to situations in which it's hard, even for the designers to understand the mechanisms that led to a certain event. This partial unknown makes sometimes hard both to blame somebody, right, and also to make up for a mistake, let's say a design mistake, if there's any of those mistakes. It's not, let's say, it's not just the machine's behavior that could be less unpredictable, more transparent. It's also us as users that are supposed to control these systems and to be responsible for them. And we have a great deal of troubles keeping up with their behavior. So being bad controllers is sometimes not really or not completely our fault. So as humans, because we're humans, we're good at some things, we're a little less good at other things. And if something bad happens because we have, for instance, been reckless, then it might be okay to be blamed for what happened. But if that same thing, because we're not capable of doing what we were supposed to do, then it is not really okay to get the blame, right? So one of these challenges is, for instance, that we tend to accept a bit too easily some of the suggestions that are provided by these intelligent systems with which we interface. We tend to say it a little differently, to rely a little bit too much on their decision making. That's it. This is because we're so-called natural born lazy, and it's just our mind and brain work sometimes under certain circumstances. Okay? Also, it's hard for us to understand what's going on with an intelligent system when it can behave in all sorts of ways that perhaps, well, they have a lot of sense, but the reasons why these actions are undertaken is completely clear to us, or it's completely unclear sometimes. Sometimes we simply don't have access, in another way to put this, to enough information, or maybe we miss the capacity to process that information. And finally, but not finally, I doubt it's finally, we're sometimes too slow to successfully interact with an artificial intelligence system, right? An automated system. It's hard to keep the pace and to remain in the loop of decisions that sometimes these decisions are just taken in a split second. And also, as I just said, sometimes we don't even have like a full account of what's going on, right? So you need even more time. How does this relate with anything? So in recent history of vehicle automation, let's put it like this, we've seen how certain accidents have put a strain on our intuitions of who should be responsible for a certain negative outcome. So vehicles are equipped with these increasingly complex, advanced automated systems, take away from the driver a lot of tasks, but yet the driver is often requested to assist when needed. But this might be sometimes, as we have seen, a very hard task for a driver, for a controller. There's going to be my colleague Daniel Haycop in the forthcoming seminar, hopefully, who will provide further arguments to really substantiate why this is the case. Okay, but from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective, one can argue that if the driver doesn't have the right capacity to control, we shouldn't probably blame them so much, right? It would be also somewhat wrong to blame, for instance, the manufacturer that can, well, of course, make a mistake, or simply they cannot predict all possible bad outcomes, right? And this is pretty much the case for all the other actors and stakeholders who participated in, for instance, I don't know, designing the traffic flow, designing the traffic regulations, standardizing the vehicles, teaching drivers. It's pretty much the same reasoning. How do you point that finger? In the absence, therefore, of a clear target for moral blame, the temptation is to resort to sometimes opportunistic, unfair forms of legal liability, okay? For instance, what we do, we might be tempted to unload the full extent of the responsibility on the shoulders of the drivers, just because they were told to remain in control of the vehicle, or they were supposed to be in control of the vehicle, right? Well, it's not even the full story, because the road, as we are seeing, is paved towards full automation. There one can say, we don't even need to show the responsibility, right, on the driver if something bad happens. Right, maybe, okay? But this means that we go from a situation where controllers have a hard time to situations where control might be apparently simply just not needed, right? So should we then also abandon responsibility? Some say we can just shift everything to some form of legal liability, right? We simply decide who's going to pay when something bad happens. It's all clear and we're set. However, it's not the end of the story, because moral responsibility, not legal liability, it's a different thing. It's important. It's important for many reasons. Here's a couple. There. So on the one hand, let's say the moral responsibility, it's important because it is one of the ways we are requested to explain to others our actions in terms of reasons. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why do I do certain things? How do I explain it to myself? How do I make sense of things, right? Through these reasons. It's an important way, in other terms, to structure cognition, communication, and social relations as well. And on the other hand, moral responsibility has also this instrumental value, right? In the sense that it enhances the sense of responsibility towards one's duties. It means that it promotes, let's say, a better effort towards doing things the right way, towards preventing harm rather than fixing it later, right? It's this kind of duty of, we call it, ethicists, active responsibility, which is forward-looking. So, question is it possible then to maintain control over these increasingly autonomous machines, cars, robots, while at the same time preserving some form of moral responsibility? Us, believe that by working out this somewhat special notion of control that is designed to accommodate, on purpose, to accommodate highly automated systems, we can help a little bit with that. Now here's don't look at it. I mean, do, but it's not supposed to be actually read. I'll guide you through the sense of this. So meaningful human control, what's that? Why is this important? As explained by Filippo, if you joined, like, I think the first of these webinars, Filippo Santoni, the CEO, in one of these previous talks, it's a notion of control that has added normative requirements and technical standards also. And those are aimed at keeping human agents responsible for the actions they perform through these automated intelligent systems. Okay, and this is a big table of different bodies that have been producing in the past, I don't know, a few years, actually, different sets of requirements with lots of recurring common themes. So this table represents different theories of meaningful human control. And it comes from the context of autonomous weapon systems, but it doesn't matter. Actually, most of those are really horizontally completely applicable to autonomous vehicles and any autonomous agent where there's high stakes in situations where the stakes are high. So controllers, as you can see, are requested to be some extent informed, aware. They need to be trained, right? They must participate to the action. The information must be available and usable. They also have to be capable, the right capacity to intervene, to control when necessary. Okay, and also it's not just about the controllers, but it's about the systems that, as you can see, they must be able and be designed in such a way that the behavior is predictable, reliable, transparent, all of these things. And also accountability. The causes of the actions must be clear to ensure accountability. So the theory that we developed with our group, it safeguards similar values, but it provides a little bit of extra philosophical foundations in the sense that it explains a little bit more how these requirements should be achieved. Just a bit, it's philosophy still, but we're doing our best. As you can see, there's only two conditions, okay? But they can be spelled out in more and simpler conditions, of course. So to the left, you can see the tracking condition, which is the one that's a little bit more like innovative, philosophically speaking. Gives us an idea of what the system should actually do to remain under control. That's what it does. Or in a different sense, it gives us an idea of what it means for an autonomous system that acts independently, right? It's independent, autonomous, to be at the same time under control of a human agent. And it prescribes this very highly sort of cognitive, in a way, psychological kind of attunement of condition, that the behavior, the system, which is composed by human operators, the devices, the infrastructure, has to be able to covary the behavior with the reasons, the intentions of a human agent, a relevant human agent, for doing something or for omitting to do something. So it has to be attuned with what the relevant stakeholders, controllers want. The tracing condition to the right, it's the one that encompasses most of the conditions that we saw in the previous slide, right? All of those normative prescriptions. And it prescribes that there must be at least one human agent in the system, design history, use context, that can appreciate the capabilities of the system, their role as target of potential moral consequences for the behavior of this system. But what does it mean anyways? It means that there must be training to achieve the proper knowledge, for instance. That cognitive and physical capacity should be in place. And there also should be the awareness of being morally responsible for what the system does, right? So there should be the full awareness of a controller, whoever that is and wherever it is, that they are responsible, morally responsible of whatever this system does, okay? So our problem and our task in a way in our past 3 years was to try and take down to earth this very abstract notion. I'm not gonna do it much. As a philosopher, I only provided conceptual handles in a way for my colleagues, Simeon Calvert and Daniel Akop, to do the extra steps, right? Because this was very interdisciplinary enterprise. Do the extra step and put all this into more practical research. They'll present more of that in the future webinars, so well, remain tuned. But before concluding, I'm going to give you another one of these scary examples. I'll give you one example of the philosophical work, but please let me guide you through this information. Don't get scared or anything. What you see here is just the first step towards making this notion of meaningful human control more usable, more practical, more, well, usable in practical, empirical, maybe social science. Again, the first one, the first of the two conditions for meaningful human control requires some sort of this stable alignment between the relevant controllers' reasons to act. Well, we can think about those like interests. Let's call them interests here for simplicity. The interests of these controllers and the behavior of the control system. Okay, so there's this attunement. But the theory doesn't say anything about, for instance, which intentions of which humans are relevant and the context and so on and so forth. And for this, what we need is to be able to identify these, potentially categorize the interests, determine which ones a certain system can or should in general be designed to respond to, and so on. So if we apply this to the case of autonomous driving system, as we did, we have different interests or reasons of the drivers. There's passengers, there's vulnerable road users, the society at large, and so on. So, but in general terms, what it does, this function of this model is to provide one criterion, proximity. Okay, it's a philosophically thick notion. It's grounded in psychology, philosophy of actions. I won't bother you with it right now. You don't need this. But with this criterion, that's what it does. We can better define what interests of which actors contributed to define a certain behavior of a certain automated system, to determine that behavior, okay? And in a way to control. We can go from driver's maneuvers, if there's still ones, we're talking about like partial automation, to their general plans of driving home, for instance, okay? But in a meaningful sense, a certain automated behavior would also be influenced by a certain design of the system, okay? Constrained. Certain decisions that were taken by certain decisions that were taken while designing the traffic, and so on. So the scale helps with both assessing, on the one hand, the roles and reasons of the many controllers that are involved in determining this behavior, and to design with those reasons more clearly in mind. Okay, so that would ultimately grant a clearer chain of control from the very beginning for the first steps of the design of the systems. Therefore, easier and more meaningful distribution of responsibility across the different involved actors. Okay, yeah, this is as clear as it gets. Conclusions. We have seen that more automation means very often less human control, okay? This means in turn that attributing responsibility, keeping people responsible for what they do, it will become harder and harder in the future, right? Potentially. But meaningful human control offers a way, that's what it does, to conceive control that's compatible with automation. And it makes as clear as possible what the relations are or should be, like normatively speaking, between these artificial agents or the self-driving cars, okay, and the people that's responsible or should be responsible or could be responsible for their actions, for their behavior. Also, what it does, importantly, it offers suggestions on how to assess and design for this control. And it does this in those systems that seem sort of in a way, by their nature, their automated nature, to be spinning out, inherently be spinning out of human control. So that's my conclusions. I'm not sure what the time is, but thank you so much. I see you're all asleep already.
Thank you very much, Giulio. And maybe there's a question in the chat. I haven't seen it, but people can enter their questions. During the presentations, there was some discussion as well. So maybe while people have a question for Giulio, we can go into the questions that popped up. And I found one very interesting, and I think that's for Baiba and Francis both. Because I see on the one hand a discussion about, hey, if the travel of time is as an indicator, the value of travel of time is not a suitable indicator for the future. How do we see the personal assessment happening in a cost-benefit analysis? And on the other hand, I see a discussion between Jeroen and Francis, which they will continue after this chat, they say. But there is something about the cost assessment. How do you charge a vehicle which is driverless and without passengers and using the network and making the road less available for other users? So maybe a reflection of both of you on the cost-benefit analysis that you can imagine from your perspective in the future.
Shall I start? Yes, it's a very, very good point indeed. Yeah, you can hear me. Okay. So what is indeed the value of travel time if we consider all the activities a person does, including activities during travel? So you can actually construct examples saying, by gaining travel time, by saving travel time, we benefit, we arrive sooner in destination. Or you can say another person by reducing travel time might lose because might not be able to finish a certain activity during travel. So my answer there was, and I think still it is valid, even if we say that that on the very aggregate level the schedules stay the same. My answer stays that you need to consider the benefits on an individual level. I am mindful of how heavy that would be on the modeling side, but still, once the activities become more substantial, which automated vehicles promise them to be, this value of travel time will be just too far fundamentally removed from what it means to change travel time.
Thank you, Baiba. Yeah, so it remains a difficult question. Yeah. Francis, maybe from with Jeroen or in general.
I think it's first good
cost
to
analysis. Yeah.
Indeed, I think it's first good to describe the situation, but I'm also very happy that Jeroen brought it up because I've just been thinking about it a little bit more, and I think you're right, Jeroen. The reasoning would be as follows, though. So essentially, you want to charge a tax which is equal to the marginal external cost of someone traveling an additional kilometer on a particular road, right? So what these external costs, this is a technical term in economics, which means if you drive 1 kilometer, what costs do you impose on others? So currently, for example, if you drive a combustion engine down the Pace Hoofdstraat, what you're doing is, you're causing some pollution for nearby residents and people walking on the street. You're also causing some noise, so there's like there's health pollution, there's noise pollution. You might also be, creating some visual pollution or so. And these are these are the externalities of driving down that road, right? So you would want to then charge that car driver for the costs that they're imposing on other people walking along that road. Now the question is, what happens when the car is empty, right? So when you compare the car when it's full to when it's empty, when it's full, the benefits of the passengers in the car are very high. The benefits are likely to outweigh those costs of driving through the road. Now, when the car is very empty, the benefits are quite low. No one's in that car. They're not benefiting from traveling anywhere. So then the external costs are likely to be larger than the benefits, essentially. So I think you're right, actually. The external costs, the taxes shouldn't necessarily be higher based on that argument. However, because the benefits are lower, people are less likely to then let their car travel empty, essentially. But I still need to think about this a little bit more. So I like the question that you brought up. I think it's an interesting point for discussion.
Yes, it's very nice. And I see some questions for Giulio coming in. And before he will answer it via chat, which he tries to do, maybe you can... maybe you can take the whole group in this discussion. So the first question is maybe how can the meaningful human control add to assessing a control? I don't know if you can explain a bit about this question. So what's the link between them?
Yeah. So yeah. It's more or less what I just wrote down here in the chat. The thing is this proximity principle. Okay, it's thick and that I did not explain and I didn't go into. But what it does, what we can do with this, it's like it provides a unit of measure to prioritize certain behaviors on others while, for instance, designing the systems. So we're facing systems where there's plenty of actors, plenty of stakeholders with different interests, right? And sometimes these interests, we need to call them reasons and intentions and goals in this particular context now, they're conflicting, right, with each other. So once you get to, for instance, and this is one example, to realize and design a certain system where you have conflicting interests and reasons, you have this one principle that you can use for the system to recognize what it pertains to, at what level. So the interest of the driver to go home, for instance, might turn out to be at some point incompatible with some higher order interests of the state that prohibits you at that very time to travel or to speed. Okay, and then the AV should respond and be able to prioritize, since you have ordered these different interests, like a pyramid, right? To prioritize different behaviors and to choose, to select the right behavior according to a certain design. It's clear because it's designed to utilize this proximity principle. That's the key thing, is the proximity. I hope this clarifies at least a little bit.
For me, it does. So hopefully also for the rest. And there's another question for you, Giulio. And that's a nice question in which the three presentations of you are mixed up. Because in the presentation of Baiba, we see people sleeping and eating in their self-driving cars. In the presentation of Francis, we imagine it even goes empty across the city. And the question is, what level of autonomy you are considering in the system? I think I can answer, but it's nice if you see your opinion on it. Is there a level of autonomy in your opinion?
It's applicable to all of the possible situations with different levels of automation. So if you have a mixed sort of driving system where, like a level 2, let's say, then you still have to consider what we call the proximal intentions, proximal reasons of the user. The most proximal reason of any behavior in a level 2 is that you can grab the wheel and intervene, right? Whether or not this is possible might be decided by comparing this very proximal behavior to some more distal decisions taken by traffic regulations, for instance. So maybe you might decide, I don't know, to remove the control of the wheel in some situations, right? It helps you with designing and thinking straight about these kinds of things. And if you have a full automation level, that's also fine, because then at that point you have this kind of control where there's only distal agents, the designers, the software developers, the policymakers, who will need, and this is the tricky thing, because it's a normative decision. Here it doesn't say anything, right? It just gives you a principle to put things into space, into 2 dimensions. Then it doesn't say who should be responsible. It only tells you what is the principle to distinguish among the different stakeholders and how to spell out the interventions, the influence that they have on the final behavior of the system. Not great, yeah. This
very clear answer. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, I think we come to the end of this webinar, and I enjoyed, the discussion in the chat and your presentations. Yeah, they were a good insight in the more human and societal impact of automated driving. I already put a slide on for the next webinar, and that is the 27th of August. And as mentioned to Giulio, we go further with the meaningful human control in the presentation of Simeon. So he puts it in practice, and so I think it's a good link. And also, Untitled is a talk about the spatial and temporal synchronization of truck platooning. So we go into the sector of the freight and platooning. So I hope all of you come back after the holidays and join this 4th webinar. And I thank you all for listening and participating in this webinar, and all the best. Thank you very much.